In today's episode of Coffee with Cloos, we're going to talk about the Stanford Encyclopedia article on the problem of evil, and that article is by philosopher Michael Tooley. In a past episode of Coffee with Cloos, we talked about the logical problem of evil, and I did a whole series on what I think is the current state of the art in the logical problem of evil, which is Jim Sturba's version. And if you want to watch a whole series explaining his logical problem of evil, one that culminates in a discussion with him, then you can check that out I'll put a link to it in the description below. Now we're going to look at the evidential problem. More specifically, we're going to look at William Rowe's famous evidential problem based around the suffering of a fawn in a forest. The fawn is trapped in a forest fire and dies an excruciating, slow, painful death. And the question is, how could a good God allow such a thing? Isn't the suffering and death of the fawn evidence that the existence of God is not likely? That's what we're looking at today. So let's jump into the Stanford Encyclopedia article. So we pick up the article at section 3.2, and it's a direct inductive version. What does Tooley mean by direct? Well, in a direct inductive version, of course, inductive is probabilistic, but direct versus indirect is the difference between actually targeting the falsity of the claim that God exists directly, or creating a separate proposition that together with the evidence makes it unlikely that God exists. So you bring in this additional proposition, and then in an inductive version, together all those things make it unlikely that God exists. Now this is direct, it's concrete. What does that mean? Concrete, well, it goes off concrete examples, the suffering of the fawn. Tooley also mentions a child dying from cancer. And then also it's deontological. So we're directly looking at the wrong making and right making properties of various actions. And that contrasts with the axiological approach, which focuses on the value of states of affairs. So let's take a look we'll read a little bit of it and then I'll comment on it. So the basic idea behind a direct inductive formulation of the argument from evil is that it involves a crucial inductive step that takes the form of an inductive projection or generalization, in which one moves from a premise concerning the known moral properties of some states of affairs to a conclusion about the likely overall moral worth of that states of affairs, given all its moral properties, both known and unknown. So what is going on in a direct inductive argument from evil is that the states of affairs we see what the moral properties are with a particular instance, and then we generalize from that on the moral properties of that as a whole, and that includes the moral properties we know of concerning an instance of evil like this, or the moral properties we don't know about. So that in that sense, you're moving from what we know about to what we know about and what is the case that we may not know about. So let's take, for instance, here's the first step in the argument. There are events in our world, such as an animal's dying an agonizing death in a forest fire, a child's undergoing lingering suffering and eventual death due to cancer, such that the actions of allowing those events, when one could prevent them, both A, have very serious known wrong-making characteristics, and B, have no right-making characteristics of which we are aware that are sufficient to balance out the known wrong-making properties. So what are these right and wrong-making properties? Well, he's saying we don't know the right-making properties that would balance out the wrong-making. And of course, the wrong-making properties mainly is the suffering, the pain which he's assuming that both the theists and atheists would agree is intrinsically bad. It's bad to be in a state of suffering and pain. Now, such an action, the actions of allowing those events, so permitting the fawn to suffer a horrible, painful death, permitting the child to suffer due to rounds of chemo and just the pain that comes with child cancer and then eventually die, that is very serious, and there's no right making. What would be the right making characteristics? In the death of the fawn in the forest fire, imagine no one even knows about it, but it happens quite frequently due to lightning strikes on forests that catch them on fire. So there's no free will involved as part of the explaining the why this bad occurred. And it's hard to see why that fawn just going through all that pain and suffering could there's some sort of good that comes out of it. I mean, I don't even know what it would be. Like, it decomposes into the earth and it feeds maybe some of the animals that are around, and like the hyena or a vulture comes and eats its carcass, and maybe that helps contribute to the overall good of the ecosystem. But even then, it looks like the amount of pain, because it's been documented just how painful burning alive is. There's the idea is that there's no amount of the goodness that could come from its death that would outweigh the badness of the suffering. Now we move from that to the key. Now, let me just say something. This is going to be the key. This is the inductive step from premise 1 to premise 2. So let's take a closer look at it. Therefore, in light of 1, it's likely that for any such action, the totality of wrong-making properties, both known and unknown, outweighs the totality of right-making properties, both known and unknown. So here we get that move from the wrong-making properties we're aware of, given the suffering of the fawn and the child dying due to cancer, and then we move to both known and unknown, that it's just a fact of the matter that for any such action like that could have been prevented, the totality of the wrong-making properties outweigh the totality of the right-making properties. 3, any action whose wrong-making properties outweigh its right-making properties is morally wrong. From 2 and 3, we get such actions are morally wrong, permitting these horrible evils to occur. 5, for any action whatever, an omnipotent and omniscient being is capable of not performing that action. So let's see then, therefore, from 4 to 5, if there is an omnipotent and omniscient being, then that being performs some morally wrong actions. Why? Because that action of allowing that suffering is wrong, from 4. And then 5, God could have not performed that action. God could have not chosen to permit that suffering. God is all powerful and all knowing, and so he could have resisted permitting that and perhaps done a miracle or some other way and prevented that from occurring. And given that, because God did allow it, we see these things happening, and we know that they happen, even if we don't directly observe them. Therefore, God performs a morally wrong action, or that being. And then 7, a being that performs morally wrong actions is not morally perfect. Therefore, from 6 and 7, we get 8. If there's an omnipotent, omniscient being, that being is not morally perfect. 9, God is by definition omnipotent, omniscient, and a morally perfect person. Therefore, from 8 and 9, we get 10. God does not exist. Now, it's worth noting here, before we go on to discuss a little bit more about the details of this argument, specifically the inductive step from premise 1 and 2, that You could go a few routes here. You could, as Philip Goff has recently done, say that God is not omnipotent. He's not all powerful. To jump off ship is 9. God is by definition omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect. So there you could deny one of those, say God is not morally perfect, and then that would show 9 is false. God is not omnipotent, all powerful. And so then you could say, look, yeah, even if there's this perfect being that you're saying is not morally perfect, well, it doesn't follow that a more limited being is not morally perfect. God's doing the best God can do given his limitations. So just thought I'd mention that as a possible way to go. So the only place, as you can see here, to really object to the argument, aside from sort of giving up on God as an omni-God, is to look at the inference from 1 to 2. So now that inference, it's good to just note that it's like, oh, can you see my dog there? There's my dog Sandy. There she is, chilling. And it's a good time to drink some coffee, so maybe just shake it out a little bit here before we jump into 3.2.2. Okay, so, but it's good to note that there's precedence for what Rowe's doing here. Like, if we observe from, there's the problem of induction, which I won't get into, but just in general, if we observe an A is a B, has property B, and every A we observe has property B, then it's not that much of a leap to say, oh, it's likely that all A's are B's, and therefore it's likely that the next A that I meet has property B. It's just a kind of a natural thing we do all the time, and science relies on it. Moving from good sample size, this has this property, and therefore it's likely that these all have these properties, this further property. And could the inductive step in the evidential argument from evil be of that form? So, quote, one philosopher who has suggested that this is the case is William Rowe. In his article, Ruminations About Evil, I love that. If you're gonna name an article, give it that sort of intrigue. He could have called this Thoughts About Evil, or he could have called it My Thinking About Evil, but that just doesn't sound good. Ruminations About Evil just has a really nice ring to it. So if you're writing philosophy papers, there's a little tip for you. Give it a nice little ring to it. So P, no good states of affair that we know of is such an omnipotent omniscience being obtaining it would morally justify that being's permitting E1 or E2. Remember, I said, well, the ecosystem, at least in that case. Now, philosophers do offer theodicies that try to explain this. The moral development, science, obviously, to progress needs people getting cancer. Why would need kids getting cancer is maybe a little more, problematic, but we're trying to find a cure for even kids getting cancer. But then you can say, why did God allow cancer in the first part? That's a bigger question. But so E1 is the fawn, and E2 is, well, he does a young girl who gets brutalized and dies, but we won't go into that one. I think that's why he switched it to childhood cancer, although that's what Rowe mentions, and that's definitely another horrendous evil. So, commenting on P, Rowe emphasizes that what proposition P says is not simply that we cannot see various goods, how various goods would justify God permitting E1 and E2, but rather the good states of affairs I know of. So it's not, he's not saying it's like I can't imagine these states of affairs that would allow God to justifiably permit these evils. It's saying the good states of affairs that I know of. The good of trying to find a cure for cancer, allow all these kids to suffer cancer and die early death and not have fullness of life on earth? Wow. That they meet one or both of these conditions, the goods I know of. Either an omnipotent being could attain them without having to permit either E1 or E2, so God could allow for the progress of science, even perhaps the discovery of a cure for cancer if he just didn't allow kids to suffer cancer. Or God could have, I don't know, allowed for the ecosystem to thrive even if he had spared the life of that fawn dying horribly in a forest fire. Or just the obtaining of those goods, the ecosystem, or the cure for cancer, or the progress of science, wouldn't morally justify that being in permitting those things. So again, we either have that the state of affairs I know of, and I'm just giving a for instance, progress, research into cancer, cure for cancer, or the good of the fawn being a small part in contributing to the functioning of the whole ecosystem. Wouldn't either God could obtain those goods, cure for cancer, God could just give the scientists the solution, or God could, in another way, provide food for the vulture and for the hyena that eat that. And then, God could have kept the ecosystem going in another way. Again, I got those philosophy hands going. Are you getting this? You seen that? So that's what you always want to get some kind of windmill motion if you're going to be doing philosophy. So you get the hands up, the hands down. Anyway, that's totally distracting. Sorry. Gotta have a little fun too. I mean, come on. We're talking about E1 and E2. This can get pretty dry and boring. We gotta spice up our life here a little bit. So Rowe goes on to say that, so again, get a little distracted here. Either God could, doesn't have to allow the kid to die from cancer or the fawn to suffer and could secure those goods, or just God wouldn't be morally justified in permitting those things. We could go more direct and just say, like, God isn't morally justified in permitting the kid to suffer cancer or the fawn to die in the forest. And then he says, so I have reason to conclude that from this, Q. So from that P, he derives Q. No good states of affairs is such that omnipotent omniscience being obtaining it would morally justify that being's permitting E1 or E2. So again, we've gone from what we know of, we look around, we see, no goods are such that God should allow these bad things to happen that we know of. And then we go to no good states of affairs, full stop, could justify God in permitting those evils. Now, Rowe uses letter J, and this is where philosophers get a little bit, especially analytic philosophers. You see, I got those hands going again. Let's just get another look at those hands. See, got to use those philosophy hands there. Okay, so Rowe uses letter J to stand for a property a good has, just in case obtaining that good would justify, J for justify, an omnipotent being permitting those evils. So J is just a property a good has, whatever that good is, that would justify God in permitting those evils. When this is done, we can compact the inference as follows. P, no good we know of has J, has the property that would the good would have that would justify God in permitting it, and therefore probably Q, no good has J. So again, we've gone from no good we know of to no good full stop. Now Rowe talks to Plantinga's criticism of this inference. He discusses it and argues that his criticism amounts to, quote, we are justified in inferring Q, no good has J, from P, no good we know of has J, only if we have a good reason to think that if there were a good that has J, it would be a good that we're acquainted with and could see it to have J. For the question can be raised, how can we have confidence in this inference unless we have a good reason to think that were a good to have J, it would likely be a good within our kin. So if we're going to, planning says, look, if you're going to go from infer Q from P, then we need a good reason to think that if a good were to have this property J, that we'd know about it, or we'd be likely to be able to observe it. Okay, Rowe then responds as follows. My answer is that we're justified in making this inference in the same way we're justified in making many inferences we constantly make from the known to the unknown. All of us are constantly inferring from the A's we know of to the A's we don't know of, right? From the A's we've observed that we know about, the A's we don't know about. If we observe many A's and note that all of them are B's, all of them, have this property, we're justified in believing that all A's we haven't observed are also B's. Of course, these inferences can be defeated. We may find some independent reason to think that if an A were a B, it would likely not be among the A's we've observed, right? So we might have an independent reason to think that, if an A were a B, it would likely not be among the A's we've observed. But to claim that we cannot be justified in making such inferences unless we already know or have good reason to believe that were an A not to be a B, it would likely be among the A's we've observed. So, what's this saying? It's a little convoluted, but the basic idea is that, as Plantinga says, hey, we are only justified in inferring no good has J from no good we know of has J, only if there was a good reason to think like that having J would be something that we'd be acquainted with. No good has J. We infer that from no good we know of has J, right? So keep that in mind. Okay, and then we come down and he says, but to claim we can't be justified, so we're not justified in making this, according to Plantinga, because we can't have confidence that is, we don't have a good reason to believe that if there were a good that has J, we'd know about it, right? So it might be something in God's mind that we can't even comprehend. So, and he says we can only make that leap from P to Q, Plantinga says, if we have that good reason to believe that we'd know about the good if it existed, right? And his, then Rowe's response is, well, but wait a minute, this is going to invite inductive skepticism because we're always going from, things that we know about to things that we don't know about. No good we know of has this property, therefore no good has this property. And then if something were to not have this property, and we would have to think that we have good reason to believe that we would have known about it. But if it didn't have that property, we'd have to think that it were in the set of things we've already observed, such that no known good has this, right? Therefore, no good has this. Well, no known good has this, but do I have reason to think that if a good did have this property, that it'd be in the set of things I'd observed? Well, I need a good reason to think that's the case in order to be justified in saying, well, that's not the case. Therefore, I can infer from that it's likely that no good has this property J, right? So you need a reason to believe that, like, putting it most simply, the reason to believe that your sample is representative of what is the case, and that if something would have been different, you would have known about it, right? But if you got to do that in order to be justified in inferring to things you don't know about, it's going to invite radical skepticism, because now you have to have good reason to believe all sorts of things in order to be justified in making that leap. You got to be able to rule out all kinds of things or rule in all kinds of things. So you invite inductive skepticism. And then Rowe points out, well, hey, look, there's two ways of taking Plantinga's criticism, A or B. A, one's entitled to infer Q from P only if she has a reason to think, like you actually have to have the reason to believe some good had J would be a good you know of, right? So you have to have a reason to infer Q from P. You have to have this reason to think you would know about it. Or B, one's entitled to infer Q from P only if you have no reason, there's no defeater in your purview, that if some good had J, it would likely not be a good she knows of, right? Because if there's no reason to think, like if you had a reason to think that if some good had J, it would likely not be a good that you know of, then you got to pause and say, well, I should be in doubt about whether this is really representative of what's actually the case, whether my knowledge of what is the case really represents what is the case, full stop. So if you have no reason to think that it's kind of like you have no defeater. If you have no reason to think that if some good had J, it would likely not be a good she knows of, then you can, he's saying you would need that, right, in order to be justified in making this leap. But Plantinga is doing A. He's saying you actually need a positive reason to think that if a good had J, you would know about it. It'd be within your kin, something you could know about. But Rowe thinks A is problematic. It's not a cogent criticism for the reason he gave earlier. Namely, it encourages inductive skepticism. If every time you're going to leap from the known to the unknown, you have to have a positive reason to think that if something, had this property, you would know about it. Oh, it doesn't have this property that I know about, therefore it doesn't have that property, right? So criticism of type B is, as Rowe says, entirely proper to advance against any inductive inference of the sort we're considering. So Rowe says, yeah, but criticism of type B is fine. And he concludes, Rowe, quote, one important route for the theist to explore is whether there's some reason to think that were a good to have J, it would either not be a good within our kin, or would be such that although we apprehend this good, we're incapable of determining that it's J, right? So you got to think about this thing. Is it really the case that if there's some reason to think it were to have J, either it would not be within our kin, right? Or it'd be such that we although we can apprehend that good, we can't even figure out that it has that property, J. That is J, just that it would justify God in permitting the evils. Now let's go ahead and take a look at 3.2.3. Let's evaluate this account of the inductive step. Okay, so important route to think is whether there's some reason to think if we have a good J, it either would not be within our kin, or such that although we apprehend the good, we're incapable of determining that it has J. Okay, so he's right that criticism of type A does involve radical skepticism, but granting that, how satisfactory is his account of the reasoning involved? So Tooley notes that to answer that question, we need to know what's going on in Rowe's claim that, quote, we observe many A's and note that all of them are B's. We're justified in believing that the A's we haven't observed are also B's is ambiguous, since the claim that we're justified in believing that the A's we haven't observed, right? So we go from if we observe many A's and note that all of them are B's, we're justified in believing that the A's we haven't observed are also B's. So we can disambiguate that further thing that we're justified in believing that the A's we haven't observed are also B's in two ways. That would be four. though, just two. Two ways. Number one, we're justified in believing that all the A's that we haven't observed are also B's. Or we could construe Rowe as making the claim that's weaker, namely two, that we're justified in believing of each of the A's that we haven't observed, that A is also B. So one is a claim about all B's we haven't observed, and two is a claim about each A we haven't observed. Of a particular A, are we justified in believing that we haven't observed that A, that A is also B? Now you might say, well, what's the relevance of this? Well, as he continues, on the one hand, Rowe is certainly right that any criticism that claims that one is not justified in inferring two, unless you have additional information, that is like to basically be able to be justified in saying of any unobserved A that I have to have a good reason to think that were it to not have property, or were it to not be a B, that I would have known about it. That's going to invite inductive skepticism, because then I just can't, I always have to have these positive reasons to make the move from known to unknown. And in most cases, we're not going to have that reason. So we're going to be trapped in going, gosh, looking for these reasons, right? So Rowe is right that invites inductive skepticism, but we can contrast that with the inference to one. So if this is the way of disambiguating what Rowe's saying, we can reject the latter inference, that while given any particular A, it's likely that A is B, it's not likely that all A's are B's, right? So we can say, like, in terms of two, we can say that it's likely, I can have a good reason to think that given all the A's observed being B's, that I can conclude from the A's I haven't observed that particular A is also B. But then, so we're not in an inductive skepticism, right? I don't have to have a reason to make that move about particular A's I haven't observed. But if you're then making a claim about all A's that you haven't observed, then he says that we can, it's likely that A has B. It's not likely that all A's are B's. And he says, compare this situation with a very long conjunction. Given any particular conjunct, it may be likely that conjunct is true, while being very unlikely that every conjunct, and hits the conjunction as a whole, is true. And in general, when it comes to probability, conjunctions have a lower likelihood of truth as compared to each individual conjunct. Just if you're looking at the conjunct, it might be likely to be true. But once you say, now, is it likely that all these things are true, the whole conjunction, that becomes extremely unlikely. So this is important because it is one that Rowe needs, since the conclusion he's drawing does not concern simply the next morally relevant property that someone might consider. Conclusion Q asserts rather that all further morally relevant properties will lack property J. And basically, we can't be confident in that unless we have some sort of reason to think that it would be likely that all the A's we haven't observed are also likely to be B. But we can't be. That's not going to be justified, because it's very unlikely that whole conjunction of unobserved A's are likely to be B's. Now, one way of supporting that latter claim is by introducing logical probability, where it's a measure of the extent to which one proposition supports another, and then argue that when you're dealing with an accidental generalization, the probability that the regularity in question will obtain gets closer and closer to zero without limit as the number of potential instances gets larger and larger, and that this is so regardless of how large one evidence base is. It is impossible then to is it impossible then to justify universal generalizations? The answer is that if laws are more than mere regularities, and in particular if there's second-order relations between universals, then the obtaining of a law, and thus the corresponding regularity, may have a very high probability upon even quite a small body of evidence. So these universal generalizations can be justified if they obtain in virtue of underlying governing laws of nature. That was a lot. It's a little bit complicated, but basically, you could rho needs one, right? Rho needs one. We're justified in believing that all the A's we haven't observed are also B's, but we could secure that by introducing some sort of logical probability where we can make sense of how one proposition supports another, and therefore the whole conjunction is supported by this body of evidence that we have, what we know about. But then he says, look, but the regularity in question will the regularity in question will obtain gets closer to zero without limit. And so as we get bigger and bigger conjunctions, basically we're going to be running ourselves probabilistically into the ground or closer to zero, and we can do that infinitely. So we're going to bottom out and just have this very low probability, even if we introduce the notion of logical probability, so we can talk about how particular conjuncts in the whole conjunction are interacting and supporting each other. But here's the thing, we might have some sort of law, right? So there might be some kind of law that holds, and therefore the conjunction could be supported by a small body of evidence via a law that says this regularity holds stably. It isn't accidental. So these universal generalizations can be justified if they can obtain in virtue of underlying governing laws. Okay, and then the question becomes whether Q, remember Q, let's go back to Q here. Q says, no good we know of has J. No good we know of has J, therefore no good has J. Is there some sort of moral law that would underlie the claim that no good has J, where God would be justified in permitting these evils? Okay, well, let's see. Okay, does Q express a law or a consequence of a law? If, as it seems plausible, it does not, then although it's true that one in justified, found a typo. It's true that one is, not one in justified in holding. See, philosophers even make mistakes, even the Stanford Encyclopedia articles, we're not perfect. It does not then, although it's true that one is justified in holding of any given, not yet observed morally relevant property, that it's unlikely to have property J, right? So morally relevant property I haven't observed. We've observed pain, right? And so on. But maybe there's something out there that we don't know about that's morally relevant that could, justify J. But we would have to say that it's some good, some morally relevant property that could be a good, that it's unlikely to have property J. It may not be the case that it's probable that no good making or right making property has J, right? So we could be justified in holding of some unobserved thing that it's unlikely to have property J, but we can't say that it's probable that no good making property has J. It may, on the contrary, be probable that there's some morally relevant property that does have J. This objection could be overcome, he notes, if one could argue that it's unlikely that there are many unknown good-making properties. So we can make that move, kind of save Rowe, and say that Q is a law if we could argue that it's unlikely there are unknown good-making properties. For if the number is small, then the probability of Q may still be high even if Q does not express a law or the consequence of law, right? So we could overcome that if we just say there are many unknown good-making properties, right? I'm inclined to think, he says, that it may well be possible to argue that it's unlikely that there are many unknown morally relevant properties, but I also think that it's very likely that any attempt to establish this conclusion would involve some very controversial metaethical claims. As a consequence, I think that one is justified in concluding that such a line of argument is not especially promising. So, this is where Tooley leaves us. He says, look, we go through all the back and forth, and I definitely recommend you check out the article because it takes a while to digest it. I've tried talking us through it. I probably could have been even more clear, but as we're just talking through it, you hash through it, you work through it. And that's what I encourage you to do. So we're left with basically Tooley concluding when you're trying to make sense of what Rowe is doing in making this inductive leap from known to unknown, observed to unobserved, that ultimately there are ways to do that, but they're not very likely, and you're going to take on board a bunch of controversial assumptions. So he doesn't think it's promising. Now, it's possible to figure that out, but he argues it's not a good way to go. So that is sort of why people have moved on from Rowe's direct inductive argument from evil. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about this? Where are you stuck in reasoning through this? I encourage you, if you are stuck, to work on it because this is great analytic thinking and it tests you in terms of keeping in mind various propositions and how they're going together. So it's a good exercise, aside from just really being able to learn about one of the most important evidential versions of the problem of evil. I'll see you on the next time of Coffee with Cloos. Keep drinking your coffee and thinking critically.